Welcome and thank you for those listening live and for those watching the recording for joining this latest installment of Welcome Change, which is Ashoka's conversation series about what's working and what's next. As always, these conversations let us hear directly from Ashoka Fellows on topics that are of particular relevance and urgency. I'm Michael Zakaras. I'm the director of Ashoka's programs in the US. We'll do a 30 to maybe 35-minute conversation since we have two fellows today, and hopefully in the last 5 to 7 minutes we can open up to some questions. People can use the Q&A button to submit them. So I'm joined by two fellows today, Alison and Lingane of the new Ownership Capital Lab, and before that of Project Equity, which she co-founded. And we have Bree Jones, founder of Parity Homes out of Baltimore. And it's hard to believe we're in the first week of September, which in the US means we just celebrated Labor Day on Monday. And it was no accident that we scheduled this conversation for this week because what we're talking about has direct relevance to labor, to wealth and asset building, to inequality in the US and elsewhere. But before we get into the full substance, I'd love to have the two fellows introduce themselves because not everyone necessarily knows you or your work. So maybe just in a couple of lines, say hello and tell us kind of the quick elevator pitch version of your ideas. And Bree, why don't we start with you and Parity Homes?
Sure. Well, let me first start by saying thank you so much, Michael and the Ashoka team, for inviting me on this conversation and also for making me a fellow. I love being an Ashoka fellow. And I want to say thank you to Allison, who has been like a big sister since I met her. I can't believe it's just been January, but has just opened so many doors for me as a up and coming entrepreneur. So thank you for that, Allison. So, my name is Bree, and I'm the founder of Parity Homes. We are a nonprofit equitable development company based out of Baltimore. And our kind of unique value proposition is that we're tackling the hyper vacancy issue in the city. So, Baltimore has 15,000 vacant buildings and 23,000 vacant lots, and mostly concentrated in historically Black communities. The vacants are a direct byproduct of historic racism, redlining, urban renewal, and displacement of Black families. And so, what Parity does is we acquire those vacant and abandoned buildings by the block, and we basically create social demand to encourage folks to come back to the community and participate in its revitalization through homeownership and different types of community engagement. So that's what we do in a nutshell, and I'll turn it over to Allison.
Mm. Just absolutely love your work. And similarly, thanks to you both. Thanks to Ashoka for hosting this conversation and for supporting this group of fellows to come together around this lens of ownership, the ownership economy, which is so important. So yeah, Alison Lingane, I'm now the I'm now the founder of the Ownership Capital Lab. I've been in the employee ownership space for about a dozen years. Most of that time as the co-founder of Project Equity, which is a respected national nonprofit with a major focus on increasing the awareness of employee ownership as a model that benefits all stakeholders. And this broad-based employee ownership is when all employees have access to becoming shared owners of their workplaces. It's really a win-win-win model. Great for the workers from a job quality and an asset building perspective, the literal sharing of the wealth that results from the ownership of successful businesses. Great for the businesses that outperform because of the high employee engagement, and great for the local economy and the community because they stay rooted locally. And the Ownership Capital Lab is really singularly focused on capital as a growth and scale lever for employee ownership. Companies are bought and sold every day in the mergers and acquisition marketplace by private equity or corporate acquirers. And for employee ownership to really play in that marketplace, we need to have enough capital behind us.
Thank you. So yeah, ownership obviously is the theme today. And Allison, we thought about calling this conversation "A Job Is Not Enough," which again during Labor Day week carries a certain potency. Tell us why a job is not enough, and focusing on wages is not enough right now.
Yeah, well, we have this continuing widening inequality, and for a long time we've been talking about the income inequality, and we know that increasing workers' paychecks is not enough to bridge really the divide of what truly matters for individuals and families, which is the wealth gap. And so ownership is the way to address the wealth gap. So if we don't focus on changing who owns, whatever you want to call it, homes or stocks or companies, we're not really going to be addressing inequality, which, as we know, is really one of the two major crises of our time, inequality and climate change. So ownership is the path to addressing our structural inequality in our economy.
Right. And so our central thesis in essence is that, we have to help workers and families participate in this, what we're calling ownership economy. And Bree, when you hear that phrase, in the context of your work, what does it conjure up? What does it mean to you? And tell us a little more about how you're opening up ownership opportunities in Baltimore.
Yeah. So for me, when I hear ownership economy, I actually think of two things. My brain goes two places. One, when I hear ownership economy, I think of gig economy, and that's the economy around, or the industry around, like freelance workers. When I hear ownership economy, I think of the industry and supportive like ecosystem that is working to create owners. And so I think of Allison's work. I think of Dr. Tim Lampkin's work in Mississippi, and others who are working to Brandon and Coalfield Development, who are working to, in their populations, in their geographies, increase a pipeline of owners. And to Allison's point, that could be home ownership, it could be business ownership, it could be stock ownership, whatever ownership we're thinking of. Um, but two, when I hear ownership economy, I studied economics in school, and I really think of the resiliency that an ownership, people who own in an economy, like how that creates resiliency, how it creates productivity, how it creates abundance, not just for the individual owners, but for the entire like system to function well. I think one thing that COVID taught us is that we are actually not a resilient society. And when there's a black swan event or an external shock, things can really quickly can go to, into a not great place. But for those of us who own assets or even just have the agency to own our life's outcomes, it increases resiliency against external shocks. And so for Parity, what we do, as I mentioned, is that we help to facilitate home ownership. So we acquire vacant properties. We work with our interested collective members to become mortgage ready. We help them with financial literacy, with wealth literacy, so that they can get a mortgage to purchase a Parity home. As a development company, we acquire the properties, we renovate the properties, so we carry most of the financial responsibility and financial risk. But at the end of the project, we have a pre-sold home buyer who was under contract during the entire construction process, who purchases their home at the end. So they'll have a mortgage, which is traditional 30-year product, and they can begin their journey to assemble and accumulate wealth. But for us, we know again that it's not just home ownership. We also partner with like wealth advisors in our community to teach our home buyers how to leverage their homes for investments in businesses if they would like. We teach them about alternative investments. We teach them about how to grow their money in whether it's through ETFs or mutual funds or insurance policies. So we really try to think holistically about how a whole healthy financially adept human would exist in our economy.
Mm. And Alison, it's interesting that Bree mentions resilience, because actually the among the many advantages of employee ownership models, one is that employee-owned companies tend to be more resilient during economic downturns, and that was definitely the case during COVID.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, I saw this firsthand in the companies that Project Equity worked with during that time period. Just the way that when it is your business, right, and there is this black swan event of COVID, and you don't know what's going to happen to your paycheck, to your business, you do everything possible to keep that business going. And we saw companies turn on a dime, not once, but over and over and over again, as the rules around what was allowed, especially in food businesses, the rules were changing daily, weekly. And it was just incredible to see how the companies that we work with, they actually ended their COVID years with the same level of profit that they had ended their non-COVID years, due to this really coming together and focusing on their business.
And Alison, there's also a timeliness to this work right now, right? As we're on the cusp of an enormous generational wealth transfer. Tell us why that matters, in the context of, at least in the context of expanding employee ownership.
Absolutely. Well, we hear this term, the great wealth transfer. And within the employee ownership space, we're very focused on the transfer of business ownership. That's often dubbed the silver tsunami, the great wave of retiring business owners. Most people don't know that 1 out of every 2 businesses in every community across the United States, where you live, rural, urban, everywhere, businesses need buyers. 1 out of every 2 of those businesses is owned by somebody at or near retirement age. That's nearly 3 million businesses. So this is a huge need. We have to preserve those assets in our communities. It's also a huge opportunity to transition them to employee ownership. Now we pair that with, the bigger picture. Great wealth transfer is certainly wealth in the form of business ownership, but also just plain old wealth is getting transferred. And it's getting transferred to folks who are younger, right, the younger generation, but also in an outsized proportion to women. So we are already seeing, and will be increasingly seeing, a huge growth in women wealth holders. And so we have these sort of new classes of wealth holders, if you will, that studies demonstrate are more interested in impact investing. And by the way, much of that wealth from their family has come through successful business enterprise. So we certainly hope that we can connect these 2 trends, the great wealth transfer, increase of women and younger wealth holders, with the silver tsunami, to create more employee ownership.
And Bree, timing really matters in your work too. I mean, one of the things that brought you into this work is watching just gentrification, right, happening all over the place, right? And developers coming in, anticipating that a market's going to get hot, buying out, or building units, flipping them, and suddenly they're high-end condos near the Metro North rail system or whatever it may be, right? And so you've developed something that you're calling development without displacement, as a way to kind of beat them in their own game and kind of get ahead of where private developers are going. Tell us a little bit about that in terms of kind of how you're trying to beat the clock a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm from New York originally, and like you said, the Metro North, like Westchester, for New York, gentrification hit Brooklyn first, then Harlem, and it kind of slowly made its way north to the Bronx and to Westchester. So as a young 20 something, having just graduated college in 2012, that's kind of when it started for us in my neighborhood. And I could kind of see it happening in real time, where neighborhoods where there were vacant buildings, boarded up buildings, were suddenly, getting bought up by investors and flipped. And suddenly these homes were going for close to $1 million. And it was also around the same time as Trayvon Martin's murder, which for me was like my George Floyd moment. And it kind of just catalyzed me to ask myself, can we do development in another way, particularly for Black communities where we're not, you know, victims of disinvestment for decades, where nothing happens and then suddenly there's a flood of investment and people get pushed out. Can we do development in a way that actually prioritizes legacy residents and holds them as the anchor to the community and keeps them there, while simultaneously opening up pathways for others to own, versus just one landlord owning, dozens or hundreds of units of properties. And so that's what got me to starting Parity, where I couldn't continue to do the work in New York, but I said, where can we do this work at scale, where we're not going to be getting into bidding wars with speculators? Where is there an abundance of housing inventory that no one is trying to tap into, probably because of anti-Black racism? And you see, cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Kansas City, where there's thousands of vacant buildings in Black neighborhoods because of all the systemic policies I talked about before. But for me, I really just fell in love with Baltimore. It just felt like an intuitively right city to do the work. It's also economically an amazing city from a jobs perspective because we have what they call the EDS, MEDS, and TEDs, which are universities, hospital systems, and technology companies. And so, from an employment standpoint, it was strong. But from a housing inventory standpoint, like I said, Baltimore has 15,000 vacant buildings. So I see it as 15,000 opportunities to turn those vacancies into something productive and something that can build wealth for 15,000 owners. And for me, what I always say is that when you own the land or when you own the assets, you own the outcomes. And so by assembling properties in bulk, by the neighborhood, by the block, we can ensure, we can't guarantee that a speculator won't come in, but if we have the majority of the vacants, we can certainly ensure that the properties that we own go to an affordable household or a household
Mm.
that's low to moderate income. So,
Mm. And so all of this, of course, for both of you, this takes money, right? So this is kind of the elephant in the room. I mean, we're sort of buying up blocks of homes, refurbishing those homes, enabling workers to buy the companies that they work for requires a certain amount of capital. And part of what we're fighting against is that, capital sort of, owners, a smaller contingent, smaller group of people in the US are taking over more and more portion of the ownership pie. We're seeing private equity do this because when you have a bottomless checkbook, you can start buying up single family homes as a kind of commodity, which we're starting to see private equity get into. So this was actually, you two joined 4 other fellows earlier in the year to talk about this kind of stuff, right? What are the big barriers to growing the ownership economy in various ways? And capital was at the top of the list, right? So Alison, can you tell us a little bit more about the money that is needed to boost this work and where it might come from?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do just want to give a shout out to the 4 other fellows who are part of this conversation and this work. So, Frank
and
Altman,
yes,
who's a long history with Community Reinvestment Fund, Brandon Dennison with Coalfield Development, Bree, obviously, Dr. Tim Lampkin with Higher Purpose Co., Molly Hempstreet with the Industrial Commons. Um, so, I mean, I referred earlier to the mergers and acquisition marketplace for, buying and selling of businesses, right? So the employee ownership space, we have almost no capital. Assets under management is the measurement of sort of how much capital our funds have combined, and we have almost no capital when you compare it to what private equity has the ability for private equity to come in and lay down the money and say to a business owner, we're interested in acquiring you. So in my own work at Ownership Capital Lab, we have what I see as a modest goal to try and expand the amount of capital for employee ownership by $1 billion in the next 5 years. And I say modest because it's modest in the scale of that marketplace. So, when we think about the amount of capital needed, it's huge, right? And so one of the policies that we led with in this the ownership economy policy brief that we recently released, all of us together, was focused on donor advised funds. And the reason for that is that there's right now, what is the number, 230 billion of money sitting in donor advised funds. So this is money that's already been given a charitable deduction, tax deduction, right, by the federal government. And most of that money is sitting in the Fidelities and the Schwabs, right? So it's being invested in the mainstream marketplace. So, but what if we could just have 10% of that invested in the ownership economy instead, and have it actually invested in moving forward the kinds of initiatives that we're talking about here that can change who owns, that can diversify ownership and address our structural inequality in our economy. So that's the kind of scale that we need to be thinking about, because the scale of the problem / opportunity is that size.
And Bree, I mean, it seems like, obviously you have your own capital needs. I don't know if you've named $1 billion as your target as well, but it's a nice round number, right? But I'm curious, like anything you want to add on the capital front and why Why is it hard to come by the capital in a world that has become very enamored with impact investing? Like you might assume that this kind of capital is all around that can invest in the kinds of projects that you all are both doing that have clear social value as well as economic value.
Yeah. So the pros and cons with real estate investment is that it's like a tried and true model. Like real estate investment is like A plus B equals C. It's kind of straightforward. The challenge is that when you're doing housing work for special like populations, or like whether it's affordability or disability, like real estate that requires creative financing, the sources get small really fast. And so for our work doing affordable housing, plainly put, we're trying to repair a harm that was committed in Black communities that have caused the economics that have caused the market to not function because of intentional policies. And so that really does require intentional capital. It requires philanthropic capital that is not necessarily return seeking. And so what we've I really believe that the federal government has a much larger role to play in the creation of affordable home ownership. In terms of affordable rentals, the federal government has the low income housing tax credits, or LITEX, which have been extremely effective at creating tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of affordable housing units across the country. We still need more, but it's a start, and it's something that the government funds on an annual basis. Simultaneously, there is no equivalent vehicle for affordable home ownership. And I think it's imperative that the federal government incentivize ownership in that way. And so there's a bill that was proposed called the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. It was proposed by Senator Ben Cardin out of Maryland, which is where I'm based. And it got some good traction, but it kind of died in Biden's infrastructure bill that was being worked on, I guess, early 2020. And so there's a lot of hope that that comes back, because that would be a huge catalyst towards really what is a national housing crisis. There's not enough housing inventory, and not just for the lower income end of the spectrum, but really for everyone. You could be making $90,000 a year and still not be able to afford a home or find a home because there's not enough housing inventory. So I think that the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act would be an incredible tax credit incentive to create more entry-level homes across the country. But the last thing I'll say is that what I've personally been exploring is, instead of purely relying on philanthropy, which is needed but is limited, thinking about how low interest impact investment or low interest debt can act like philanthropy over a long period of time. Over 15 years, if we're amortizing a $1 million loan at 1%, that is essentially philanthropy. Like I could, I could make those payments myself, if it's low enough. So it can still, create the outcome, which is affordable housing. The investor can still make their return just over a longer period.
Yeah.
Um, and it allows us to 10x or 100x the amount of capital that is available to us to do that work. Um, the last thing I'll say is that Parity has really been leading the charge around kind of creating a fund like this, but across all of Baltimore. So not just for Parity's blocks or Parity's neighborhoods, but really how can we create a fund that all developers, affordable housing, organizations can tap into to tackle Baltimore's 15,000 vacants at scale. So that's something that we've also been trying to put legislation around, and
Mm.
hopefully in a year or so that'll start to move forward.
I mean, that's such an appealing pitch, I think, to someone who has money in a donor advised fund, or who is thinking about kind of a blend of impact investing and philanthropic capital, in part because if you're enabling people to, with that kind of a very low interest loan, own a home for the first time, or own a part of a business for the first time, that's setting people on a sort of permanently different path. And it's not the kind of money that has to keep coming back to sort of develop and service programs, right? So I feel like that's a really strong case. And still a bit mystified why there isn't more money directed there, given we have an abundance of it in the United States. But you also mentioned policy, and of course, very related with the kinds of capital and certainly the role that the government, including the federal government, can play in sort of creating a tailwind for this work. And so policy was the other big lever that we talked about as a group of 6 fellows back in January. And again, we've dropped the link into this hot off the press sort of jointly created white paper that outlines 7 policy recommendations. Alison, do you want to give us a little window into another one? So Bree, you mentioned the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Alison, tell us about the Capital for Cooperatives Act and what that might do for your work.
Yeah, well, in the employee ownership space, one of the real issues is like if you were to go and try and get a business loan at a bank, you might be able to do that, and they would require you to sign what's called a personal guarantee. So meaning your business goes belly up, you're still liable for that loan, right? They're gonna sort of go after your assets. The problem is if you have a 50-person business or a 500-person business, which of those owners, because in employee ownership, the full workforce is the base of the ownership, which of those owners is going to sign that personal guarantee? And so the federal government has opened up capital access for businesses in a couple of very important ways. And one of them is through a loan guarantee program. It's called the SBA 7A loan guarantee. And we had some precedents during COVID. Actually, we were talking about COVID earlier, that both the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP loans, as well as the EIDL loans, which is the Economic Injury Disaster loans, were made to cooperatives during that time period without requiring a personal guarantee. It makes sense, right? These are businesses owned by a whole big group of people, but sort of the everyday business of doing these 7A loan guarantees, which is, by the way, what has opened up small business lending writ large, because banks are risk averse to small business. Still require personal guarantee for most of employee ownership. So the SBA did, through a rule change, open up the ESOP form of employee ownership. Majority ESOPs are no longer required, but sort of the market fit for employee ownership and the 7A loan, most of it requires that personal guarantee. So that's really important. And that's in sort of the small business marketplace. In the M&A marketplace, the merger and acquisition marketplace, there's also ways that the federal government has opened up capital. And there's a program at the SBA called the SBIC. And there's about 300 SBIC funds that access subsidized capital from the federal government. So you can go and raise $100 million of private capital and get up to $200 million from the federal government matching capital at very low rates. So, 100 million of private at market rate and then 2/3 of your total fund at very low rates. So you have this blended rate then that you can bring out. So through subsidized federal capital, companies are being bought and sold every day. Now we need more of that capital to be used by the employee ownership space. And I believe that there's a path to us doing that.
And do you think that this is an appeal that will resonate with people across the political spectrum? I mean, there's not many that do these days, but this is one of the potential advantages of this is that we can talk to, in this country or anywhere, the left and the right, and they both understand the value of opening up ownership opportunities. They both see the value of keeping wealth in small and medium-sized towns.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Ownership or self-determination, right? We're talking about people's freedoms to create their own opportunities and their own paths. This is central to our American identity, right? But the fact is that the opportunity to participate in what we're calling the ownership economy has gotten harder and harder. And I really do believe that people feel this and recognize we need to do something about it. And I can say that in the employee ownership space, we consistently see it as a topic that brings people together from across the aisles. It typically has unanimous support when any new legislation is voted on.
One of the questions that somebody asked, Jill Violet, actually, hi Jill, who's an Ashoka Fellow, was about outside the US and for ideas, or she was asking if there's other countries that support the ownership economy through policy initiatives through incentives. Alison, you and I were just talking about this in the context of the UK. Do you want to just very briefly share kind of how they're quite straightforward and favorable incentive is facilitating a real explosion in employee ownership there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UK has chosen one of the forms of broad-based employee ownership. I won't go into all the details, but they use an employee ownership trust there and have very straightforward tax incentives to be able to have no capital gains tax on the sale of a company. And that's a really important tax benefit. If you're a selling business owner, you want to keep most of the sale price in your pocket, and the capital gains tax relief, if you will. And so they have just seen their numbers of employee-owned companies go up and up and up at an increasing rate. And you contrast that in the United States, we have the ESOP, which is the biggest form of broad-based employee ownership. And it's got a tremendous number of tax benefits, but it's very complex, a lot of sort of hoops to jump through in order to get those tax benefits.
Yeah, and Canada also, for Jill's question, they also just passed their first legislation, not quite as favorable on the tax side as the UK, but it's up to $10 million in a write-off, essentially a capital gains write-off for selling. So they're trying to encourage that. So it's encouraging to see this taking off in different parts of the world as well. And people continuing to learn about it and work collectively, just like we are doing with this group of fellows, to sort of get smart and support one another in advancing all of this and overcoming these big barriers. So when we think we're basically at time here. So when you both think about those who are listening in, kind of what you want them to take away from this, what role can they play in bringing more attention to this work and its potential for sort of, again, opening up wealth building opportunities and for more Americans and the ability to live what we like to call choice-filled lives. What do you want them to take away? We can kind of end on that note from each of you.
Maybe I'll start. I'll just quickly acknowledge a couple. There's some really good questions in the chat. One around like the how do we both usher in economic justice while acknowledging the historic injustice. And as anyone who like runs a nonprofit, especially in like America, you are constantly in that like battle of wanting to like overturn the entire system because you know how like terrible it is while still having to maneuver in capitalism. So that is just a real constraint and a real challenge. There's another question about how do we compete against private equity firms that are buying up housing stock. A long-term implementation would be legislation. I really do think that we need to be restricting the ability of PE firms to purchase what really should be a basic human right, which is the access to housing. But in the short term, we've been talking about impact investment loans, low interest, long-term loans that allow community groups to be competitive acquirers of property would be the next best thing in the immediate term. And Michael, to your question about like what can people do now, I would say one, be vocal about some of these legislative policies and suggestions that we can bring forward, because I really do think that if we can legislate some of these things, or if we can ensure that the federal government is prioritizing it, it will really help to make all of our work easier in the ownership economy. But two, I mean, if you are a funder, I would say fund this work, mobilize, other funders, create consortiums that fund this work. Within like the 5 fellows that met through Ashoka around the ownership economy, we each uniquely represent kind of like a interesting vertical in the ownership economy. And there's something really interesting to be said around. There was another question, what would you do with $100 million? We would probably split that between each of us, so 20 million each, and let's see how we can create those connective tissues between all of our work to create like a truly robust ownership economy. And then for anyone who's a fellow who's doing this work, I would say just keep the faith, keep the fight. It's really hard, but I think the solace for me is knowing that there's other people who are also doing this work, who are having similar challenges, but who are getting up every day to keep fighting. So just keep doing the work.
Alison, closing thoughts on that?
Well said. So well
Thank you,
said.
Bree.
Yeah. +1 on everything Bree just said. Yeah, I would definitely definitely say talk about the ownership economy and the importance of ownership, whoever you are, whatever your role is, right? If you're a practitioner working on issues, a funder, an asset allocator, work in government, just ask about ownership when you're in conversations with people of influence. What are you doing to help broaden access to ownership? And I actually want to quote Santosh Ramdas of Gary Community Ventures as one example. Whenever he's speaking to a fund that has approached his organization for investment, he always asks, how are you sharing ownership with the people who are creating the economic value? Right? Just asking those questions is so powerful and so important.
Wonderful. Okay, well, time always flies by with the two of you. So thank you for joining. Thanks for those listening in. And yeah, we'll keep this exciting work growing. So enjoy your weeks and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Ashoka.